The Somerton Man was an unidentified man whose body was found on December 1, 1948 on the beach at Somerton Park, a suburb of Adelaide, South Australia. The case is also known by the Persian phrase tam shud, meaning it is over or it is finished, which was printed on a scrap of paper found months later in the fob pocket of the man's trousers. The scrap had been torn from the final page of a copy of Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a poetry book following a public appeal by police. The book from which the page had been torn was located. On the inside back cover, detectives could read indentations left from previous handwriting, a local telephone number, another unidentified number, and text that resembled a coded message. The text has not been deciphered or interpreted in a way that satisfies authorities on the case since the early stages of the police investigation. The case has been considered one of Australia's most profound mysteries. There has been intense speculation ever since regarding the identity of the victim, the cause of his death, and the events leading up to it. Public interest in the case remains significant for several reasons. The death occurred at a time of heightened international tensions following the beginning of the Cold War. The apparent involvement of a secret code, the possible use of an undetectable poison, and the inability or unwillingness of authorities to identify the dead man. On July 26, 2022, University of Adelaide professor Derek Abbott, in association with genealogist Colleen M. Fitzpatrick, concluded the man was Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker born in 1905, based on genetic genealogy from DNA of the man's hair. South Australia Police and Forensic Science South Australia did not verify the result, although they were hopeful of being able to do so. On December 1, 1948 at 6:30 a.m., the police were contacted after the body of a man was discovered by a couple on Somerton Park Beach near Glenelg, about 11 kilometers (7 miles) southwest of Adelaide, South Australia. The police agreed a decision that hampered later investigations. In news media, books and other discussions of the case, Thompson was frequently referred to by various pseudonyms, including the nickname Justin, and names such as Teresa Johnson Nebraska Powell. Feltus in 2010 claimed he was given permission by Thompson's family to disclose her names and that of her husband, Prosper Thompson. Nevertheless, the names Feltus used in his book were pseudonyms. Feltus also stated that her family did not know of her connection with the case, and he agreed not to disclose her identity or anything that might reveal it. Thompson's real name was considered important because it may be the decryption key for the purported code. When she was shown the plaster cast bust of the dead man by D.S. Lean, Thompson said she could not identify the person depicted. Lean described her reaction upon seeing the cast as completely taken aback, to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint. In an interview many years later, Paul Lawson, the technician who made the cast and was present when Thompson viewed it, noted that after looking at the bust she immediately looked away and would not look at it again. Thompson also said that while she was working at Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney during World War II, she had owned a copy of Rubaiyat. In 1945, at the Clifton Gardens Hotel in Sydney, she had given it to an Australian Army lieutenant named Alf Boxall, who was serving at the time in the water transport section of the Royal Australian Engineers. Thompson told police that, after the war ended, she had moved to Melbourne and married. She said that she had received a letter from Boxall and had replied, telling him that she was now married. The man was found lying in the sand across from the crippled children's home, which was on the corner of the Esplanade and Bickford Terrace. He was lying back with his head resting against the seawall, with his legs extended and his feet crossed. Subsequent research suggests that her future husband, Prosper Thompson, was in the process of obtaining a divorce from his first wife in 1949, and that he did not marry Jessica until mid-1950. There is no evidence that Boxall had any contact with Jessica Thompson after 1945 as a result of their conversations with Thompson. Police suspected that Boxall was the dead man. However, in July 1949, Boxall was found in Sydney and the final page of his copy of Rubaiyat, reportedly a 1924 edition published in Sydney, was intact, with the words Tamam Shud still in place. Boxall was now working in the maintenance section at the Randwick bus depot, where he had worked before the war, and was unaware of any link between the dead man and himself. In the front of the copy of Rubaiyat that was given to Boxall, Jessica Harkness had signed herself Justin and written out verse 70. Indeed, indeed, repentance oft before I swore, but was I sober when I swore? And then came spring, and rose in hand my threadbare penitence a pieces tore. The two daily Adelaide newspapers, the Advertiser and the News, covered the death in separate ways. The Advertiser first mentioned the case in a small article on page 3 of its morning edition of December 2, 1948. Titled Body Found on Beach, it read, "A body believed to be of E.C. Johnson, about 45, of Arthur St. Paynham, was found on Somerton Beach, opposite the crippled children's home yesterday morning. The discovery was made by Mr. J. Lyons of White Road, Somerton. Detective H. Strangway and Constable J. Moss are inquiring." The News featured their story on its first page, giving more details of the dead man. As one journalist wrote in June 1949, alluding to the line in Rubaiyat, "The Somerton man seems to have made certain that the glass would be empty, save for speculation." An editorial called the case one of Australia's most profound mysteries, and noted that if he died by poison so rare and obscure it could not be identified by toxicology experts, then surely the culprit's advanced knowledge of toxic substances pointed to something more serious than a mere domestic poisoning. It was believed the man had died while sleeping. A half-smoked cigarette was on the right collar of his coat. A number of possible identifications have been proposed over the years. On December 3, 1948, a day after the Advertiser named him as the likely victim, E.C. Johnson identified himself at a police station. That same day, the News published a photograph of the dead man on its front page, leading to additional calls from members of the public about his possible identity. By December 4, police had announced that the man's fingerprints were not on South Australian police records, forcing them to look further afield. On December 5, the Advertiser reported that police were searching through military records after a man claimed to have had a drink with a person resembling the dead man at a hotel in Glenelg on November 13. During their drinking session, the mystery man supposedly produced a military pension card bearing the name Solomonson. In early January 1949, two people identified the body as that of 63-year-old former woodcutter Robert Walsh. A third person, James Mack, also viewed the body, initially could not identify it, but an hour later he contacted police to claim it was Walsh. Mack stated that the reason he did not confirm this at the viewing was a difference in the color of the hair. Walsh had left Adelaide several months earlier to buy sheep in Queensland but had failed to return at Christmas as planned. Police were skeptical, believing Walsh to be too old to be the dead man. However, the police did state that the body was consistent with that of a man who had been a woodcutter, although the state of the man's hands indicated he had not cut wood for at least 18 months. Any thoughts that a positive identification had been made were quashed, however, when Elizabeth Thompson, one of the people who had earlier positively identified the body as Walsh, retracted her statement after a second viewing of the body, where the absence of a particular scar on the body, as well as the size of the dead man's legs, led her to realize the body was not Walsh. A search of his pockets revealed an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, a bus ticket from the city that may not have been used, a narrow aluminium comb that had been manufactured in the U.S., a half-empty packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, an Army Club cigarette packet which contained 7 cigarettes of a different brand, Kensitas, and a quarter-full box of Bryant and May matches. By early February 1949, there had been 8 different positive identifications of the body, including 2 Darwin men who thought the body was of a friend of theirs, and others who thought it was a missing station worker, a worker on a steamship, or a Swedish man. Detectives from Victoria initially believed the man was from there, because of the similarity of the laundry marks to those used by several dry cleaning firms in Melbourne. Following publication of the man's photograph in Victoria, 28 people claimed to know his identity. Victoria detectives disproved all the claims and said that other investigations indicated it was unlikely that he was from Victoria. A seaman named Tommy Reed from the SS Cycle, in port at the time, was thought to be the dead man, but after some of his shipmates viewed the body at the morgue, they stated categorically that the corpse was not that of Reed. By November 1953, police announced they had recently received the 251st solution to the identity of the body from members of the public who claimed to have met or known him, but they said that the only clue of any value remained the clothing the man wore. Contemporary reports considered the connection with the death of a 2-year-old boy 6 months later. On June 6, 1949, the body of 2-year-old Clive Magnuson was found in a sack in the Largs Bay Sand Hills, about 20 kilometers (12 miles) north of Somerton Park. Lying next to him was his unconscious father, Keith Waldemar Magnuson. The father was taken to a hospital in a very weak condition, suffering from exposure. Following a medical examination, he was transferred to a mental hospital. The Magnussons had been missing for 4 days. The police believed that Clive had been dead for 24 hours when his body was found. The two were found by Neil McRae of Largs Bay, who claimed he had seen the location of the two in a dream the night before. The coroner could not determine the young Magnusson's cause of death. Although it was not believed to be natural causes, the contents of the boy's stomach were sent to a government analyst for further examination. Witnesses who came forward said that on the evening of November 30th, they had seen an individual resembling the dead man lying on his back in the same spot where the corpse was later found. Following the death, the boy's mother, Roma Magnusson, reported having been threatened by a masked man who, while driving a battered cream car, almost ran her down outside her home in Cheapside Street, Largs North. Magnusson stated that the car stopped and a man with a khaki handkerchief over his face told her to keep away from the police or else. Additionally, a similar-looking man had been recently seen lurking around the house. Magnusson believed that this situation could be related to her husband's attempt to identify the Somerton Man, believing him to be Carl Thompson, who had worked with him in Renmark in 1939. Soon after being interviewed by police over her harassment, Magnusson collapsed and required medical treatment. J.M. Gower, secretary of the Largs North Progress Association, received anonymous phone calls threatening that Mrs. Magnusson would meet with an accident if he interfered, while H. Curtis, the acting mayor of Port Adelaide, received 3 anonymous phone calls threatening an accident if he stuck his nose into the Magnusson affair. Police suspect the calls may be a hoax, and the caller may be the same person who also terrorized a woman in a nearby suburb, who had recently lost her husband in tragic circumstances. In addition to intense public interest in Australia during the late 1940s and early 1950s, the case also attracted international attention. South Australia police consulted their counterparts overseas and distributed information about the dead man internationally, in an effort to identify him. International circulation of a photograph of the man and details of his fingerprints yielded no positive identification. For example, in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was unable to match the dead man's fingerprint with prints taken from files of domestic criminals. A couple who saw him at around 7 p.m. noted that they saw him extend his right arm to its fullest extent and then drop it limply. Scotland Yard was also asked to assist with the case, but could not offer any insights. In 1949, the body of the unknown man was buried in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery, where the Salvation Army conducted the service. The South Australian Grandstand Bookmakers Association paid for the service to save the man from a pauper's burial. Years after the burial, flowers began appearing on the grave. Police questioned a woman seen leaving the cemetery, but she claimed she knew nothing of the man. About the same time, Ina Harvey, the receptionist from the Strathmore Hotel opposite Adelaide Railway Station, revealed that a strange man had stayed in room 21 or 23 for a few days around the time of the death, checking out on November 30, 1948. She recalled that he was English-speaking and only carrying a small black case, not unlike one a musician or a doctor might carry. When an employee looked inside the case, he told Harvey he had found an object inside the case he described as looking like a needle. On November 22, 1959, it was reported that one E.B. Collins, an inmate of New Zealand's Whanganui prison, claimed to know the identity of the dead man. In 1978, ABC TV, in its documentary series Inside Story, produced a program on the Tamshud case, titled The Somerton Beach Mystery, where reporter Stuart Littlemore investigated the case, including interviewing Boxall, who could add no new information, and Paul Lawson, who made the plaster cast of the body, and who refused to answer a question about whether anyone had positively identified the body. In 1994, John Harbour Phillips, Chief Justice of Victoria and Chairman of the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, reviewed the case to determine the cause of death and concluded that there seems little doubt it was digitalis. Phillips supported his conclusion by pointing out that the organs were engorged, consistent with digitalis, the lack of evidence of natural disease, and the absence of anything seen macroscopically which could account for the death. Another couple who saw him from 7:30 p.m. to 8 p.m., during which time the streetlights had come on, recounted that they did not see him move during the half an hour in which he was in view, although they did have the impression that his position had changed. Former South Australian Chief Superintendent Len Brown, who worked on the case in the 1940s, stated that he believed that the man was from a country in the Warsaw Pact, which led to the police's inability to confirm the man's identity. The South Australian Police Historical Society holds the plaster bust, which contains strands of the man's hair. Any further attempts to identify the body have been hampered by the embalming formaldehyde having destroyed much of the man's DNA. Other key evidence no longer exists, such as the brown suitcase, which was destroyed in 1986. In addition, witness statements have disappeared from the police file over the years. There has been persistent speculation that the dead man was a spy, due to the circumstances and historical context of his death. At least two sites relatively close to Adelaide were of interest to spies: the Radium Hill uranium mine and the Woomera test range, an Anglo-Australian military research facility. The man's death also coincided with the reorganisation of Australian security agencies, which would culminate the following year with the founding of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO. This would be followed by a crackdown on Soviet espionage in Australia, which was revealed by intercepts of Soviet communications under the Venona project. Another theory concerns Boxall, who was reportedly involved in intelligence work during and immediately after World War II. In a 1978 television interview, Stuart Littlemore asks, "Mr. Boxall, you had been working, hadn't you, in an intelligence unit, before you met this young woman, Jessica Harkness? Did you talk to her about that at all?" In reply, Boxall says no, and when asked if Harkness could have known, Boxall replies, "Not unless somebody else told her." Although they commented between themselves that it was odd that he was not reacting to the mosquitoes, they had thought it more likely that he was drunk or asleep, and thus did not investigate further. When Littlemore suggests in the interview that there may have been an espionage connection to the dead man in Adelaide, Boxall replies, "It's quite a melodramatic thesis, isn't it?" Boxall's Army service record suggests that he served initially in the 4th Water Transport Company, before being seconded to the North Australia Observer Unit (NOU), a special operations unit, and that during his time with NOU Boxall rose rapidly in rank, being promoted from Lance Corporal to Lieutenant within 3 months. In 2011, an Adelaide woman contacted biological anthropologist Mache Henneberg about an identification card of an H.C. Reynolds that she had found in her father's possessions. The card, a document issued in the United States to foreign seamen during World War I, was given to Henneberg in October 2011 for comparison of the ID photograph to that of the Somerton Man. While Henneberg found anatomical similarities in features such as the nose, lips and eyes, he believed they were not as reliable as the close similarity of the ear. The ear shapes shared by both men were a very good match, although Henneberg also found what he called a unique identifier: a mole on the cheek that was the same shape and in the same position in both photographs. Together with the similarity of the ear characteristics, this mole in a forensic case would allow me to make a rare statement positively identifying the Somerton Man. The ID card, numbered 58757, was issued in the United States on February 28, 1918 to H.C. Reynolds, giving his nationality as British and age as 18. Searches conducted by the U.S. National Archives, the UK National Archives and the Australian War Memorial Research Centre have failed to find any records relating to H.C. Reynolds. The South Australia Police Major Crime Branch, who still have the case listed as open, will investigate the new information. Some independent researchers believe the ID card belonged to Horace Charles Reynolds, a Tasmanian man who died in 1953 and therefore could not have been the Somerton Man. One of the witnesses told the police she observed a man looking down at the sleeping man from the top of the steps that led to the beach. Witnesses said the body was in the same position when the police viewed it. Self-published source. Prosper Thompson died in 1995 and Jessica Thompson died in 2007. In November 2013, 3 of their relatives gave interviews to the Channel 9 current affairs program 60 Minutes. Kate Thompson, the daughter of Jessica and Prosper Thompson, said that her mother was the woman interviewed by the police, and that her mother had told her she had lied to them. Jessica did know the identity of the Somerton Man, and his identity was also known to a level higher than the police force. She suggested that her mother and the Somerton Man may both have been spies, noting that Jessica Thompson taught English to migrants, was interested in communism, and could speak Russian, although she would not disclose to Kate where she had learned it or why. Roma Egan, the widow of Jessica Thompson's son Robin, and Robin and Roma's daughter Rachel Egan, also appeared on 60 Minutes. They suggested that the Somerton Man was Robin's father and, therefore, Rachel's grandfather. The Egan's reported lodging a new application with the Attorney General John Rao to have the Somerton man's body exhumed and DNA tested. University of Adelaide professor Derek Abbott subsequently wrote to Rao in support of the Egans, saying that exhumation for DNA testing would be consistent with the federal government's policy of identifying soldiers in war graves, to bring closure to their families. Kate Thompson opposed the exhumation as being disrespectful to her brother. In October 2011, as interest in the case resurfaced, Attorney General John Rao refused to exhume the body, stating, "There needs to be public interest reasons that go well beyond public curiosity or broad scientific interest." Feltis said he was still contacted by people in Europe who believed the man was a missing relative but did not believe in exhumation and finding the man's family grouping would provide answers to relatives, as during that period so many war criminals changed their names and came to different countries. In October 2019, however, Attorney General Vicky Chapman granted approval for his body to be exhumed to extract DNA for analysis. The parties interested in the analysis agreed to cover the costs. Another witness came forward in 1959 and reported to the police that he and 3 others had seen a well-dressed man carrying another man on his shoulders along Somerton Park Beach the night before the body was found. A potential granddaughter's DNA was planned to be compared to the unknown man's to see if it is a match. An exhumation was carried out on May 19, 2021. Police stated that the remains were in reasonable condition and were optimistic about the prospect of DNA recovery. The remains were deeper in the ground than previously thought. It was reported that the body was exhumed as part of Operation Persevere and Operation Persist, which are investigating historical unidentified remains in South Australia. The authorities have said that they intend to take DNA from the remains if possible. And Coxon, the Assistant Director of Operations at Forensic Science South Australia, said, "The technology available to us now is clearly light years ahead of the techniques available when this body was discovered in the late 1940s, and that tests would use every method at our disposal to try and bring closure to this enduring mystery." In March 2009, a University of Adelaide team led by Abbott began an attempt to solve the case through cracking the code and proposing to exhume the body to test for DNA. His investigations have led to questions concerning the assumptions police had made on the case. Abbott also tracked down the Barber waxed cotton of the period and found packaging variations. This may provide clues to the country where it was purchased. It was determined the letter frequency of the message in the back of the rubaiyat was considerably different from letters written down randomly. The frequency was to be further tested to determine if the alcohol level of the writer could alter random distribution. They observed that the format of the code also appeared to follow the quatrain format of rubaiyat, leading them to theorize that the code was a one-time pad encryption algorithm. A police report was made by Detective Don O'Doherty. According to the pathologist John Burton Cleland, the man was of Britisher appearance and thought to be aged about 4045. He was in top physical condition. Copies of rubaiyat, as well as the Talmud and Bible, were being compared to the code using computers to get a statistical base for letter frequencies. However, the code's short length meant the investigators would require the exact edition of the book, used with the original copy lost in the 1950s. Researchers have been looking for a Fitzgerald edition. The team concluded that it was most likely that each letter was the first letter of a word. An investigation had shown that the Somerton man's autopsy reports of 1948 and 1949 are now missing, and the Barr Smith Library's collection of Cleland's notes do not contain anything on the case. Mache Henneberg, professor of anatomy at the University of Adelaide, examined images of the Somerton man's ears and found that his Simba, upper ear hollow, is larger than his Kavam, lower ear hollow, a feature possessed by only 12% of the Caucasian population. In May 2009, Abbott consulted with dental experts who concluded that the Somerton man had hypodontia, a rare genetic disorder, of both lateral incisors, a feature present in only 2% of the general population. In June 2010, Abbott obtained a photograph of Jessica Thompson's eldest son Robin, which clearly showed that he, like the unknown man, had not only a larger Simba than Kavam but also hypodontia. The chance that this was a coincidence has been estimated as between 1 in 10 million and 1 in 20 million. The media have suggested that Robin Thompson, who was 16 months old in 1948 and died in 2009, may have been a child of either Boxall or the Somerton man and passed off as Prosper Thompson's son. DNA testing would confirm or eliminate this speculation. Abbott believes an exhumation and an autosomal DNA test could link the Somerton man to a short list of surnames which, along with existing clues to the man's identity, would be the final piece of the puzzle. He was 180 centimeters 5 feet 11 inches, tall with gray eyes, fair to ginger-colored hair, slightly gray around the temples, with broad shoulders and a narrow waist, hands and nails that showed no signs of manual labor, big and little toes that met in a wedge shape, like those of a dancer or someone who wore boots with pointed toes, and pronounced high calf muscles consistent with people who regularly wore boots or shoes with high heels or performed ballet. After discovering that Robin Thompson had died in 2009, Abbott contacted Rachel, the daughter of Roma Egan and Robin Thompson, who had been adopted and grew up in New Zealand. Abbott and Rachel married in 2010 and they have 3 children. The family has a painting of the Somerton Man hanging in their home. Believing him to be family, however, Rachel Egan's DNA has been analyzed and links were found to the grandparents of Prosper Thompson. In July 2013, Abbott released an artistic impression he commissioned of the Somerton Man, believing this might finally lead to an identification. All this time we've been publishing the autopsy photo, and it's hard to tell what something looks like from that, Abbott said. In December 2017, Abbott announced 3 excellent hairs at the right development stage for extracting DNA had been found on the plaster cast of the corpse, and had been submitted for analysis to the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA at the University of Adelaide. Processing the results could reportedly take up to a year while much of the DNA is degraded. In February 2018, the University of Adelaide team obtained a high-definition analysis of the mitochondrial DNA from the hair sample from Somerton Man. They found that the Somerton Man belonged to haplogroup H41A1A, possessed by only 1% of Europeans. However, mitochondrial DNA is only inherited through the maternal line, and therefore cannot be used to investigate a hereditary link between Rachel Egan, Abbott's wife, and the Somerton Man. On July 26, 2022, Abbott announced that he and genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick had determined that the man was Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker born on November 16, 1905 in Footscray, a suburb of Melbourne. Abbott claimed his DNA identification from strands of hair found in the plaster death mask made by South Australian police in the late 1940s. He was dressed in a white shirt, a red, white and blue tie, brown trousers, socks and shoes, a brown knitted pullover and fashionable gray and brown double-breasted jacket of reportedly American tailoring. Through investigative genetic genealogy, matches were found for descendants of 2 distant cousins of Webb, on both the paternal and the maternal side. By the time the identification was made, none of Webb's still living relatives had known him personally. Initially, there were no known pre-death photographs of Webb, but an independent researcher discovered a 1921 photograph of a Swinburne Technical College football team that included a C. Webb, without identifying him directly. In November 2022, Australian Story revealed photographs of Webb from the 1920s found in a Webb family photo album. Earlier, the ABC had published photos of Webb's brother, Roy Webb, claiming they resembled the Somerton Man. Abbott and Fitzpatrick believed that Webb had serious mental health issues and spiraled down after losing 4 close relatives in 7 years his history, and the autopsy findings suggest he died by suicide by poisoning himself. Forensic Science South Australia, who were still investigating, declined to comment on Abbott's findings. South Australia Police had not verified the result, but stated they were cautiously optimistic that this may provide a breakthrough. Carl Charles Webb was born on November 16, 1905 in Footscray, a suburb of Melbourne, the youngest of 6 children. Carl Webb's father, Richard August Webb 18661939, had emigrated to Australia from Hamburg, Germany. He married Eliza Amelia Morris Grace 1871146. In 1892 they opened a bakery in Springvale. Victoria and the family's 3 sons would all eventually work there. When the bakery closed down, Webb retrained as an electrical instrument maker. Webb's older brother, Roy Webb, had died in Burma in 1943, while he was a prisoner of war and apparently undergoing forced labor on the Thailand-Burma Railway. Webb's oldest sister, Frida Grace Keane (N.E. Webb), had a son named John who had died in the United Kingdom while serving with the Royal Australian Air Force (RAAF), also in 1943. All labels on his clothes had been removed, and he had no hat, unusual for 1948, or wallet. He was clean-shaven and carried no identification, which led police to believe he had committed suicide. On October 4, 1941, Webb married Dorothy Doff Robertson, a pharmacist and chiropodist. The couple moved into a flat in Bromby Street, South Yarra. She later said that the marriage was not a harmonious one, largely due to Webb's personality. She described him as solitary, having few friends, living a quiet life and being in bed by 7 p.m. each night, but also moody, violent and threatening, especially when facing defeat even over relatively trivial matters. She stated he was fond of poetry and wrote several poems of his own, most of them on the subject of death, which he claims to be his greatest desire. This would be consistent with a copy of the Rubaiyat, which also focuses on the subject of death. Abbott's research indicates Webb enjoyed betting on horses, thus the coded messages in the book could be horse names. Dorothy Webb also said that, in March 1946, her husband had attempted suicide with an overdose of ether, that she had then nursed him back to health and he had scolded her for it, and had become more violent. In September 1946, she fled from her husband, alleging years of physical and verbal abuse. Webb had moved out in 1947, and no official records revealing his subsequent whereabouts had been found. Members of the Webb family subsequently mentioned that he had moved to the Perth suburb of Cotslow, but that they had lost contact with him there by 1951. Dorothy Webb was reportedly living in Butte, South Australia, 144 kilometers, 89 miles from Adelaide. Abbott speculates that Webb may have gone to Adelaide intending to find her. She applied for a divorce on June 5, 1951, citing desertion, resulting in a hearing on October 29, and the divorce was granted in April 1952. Webb's brother-in-law John Keene's possessions included items which suggested that he had been to the United States, such as coins and a map of Chicago, possibly as a result of him undergoing aircrew training in Canada en route to the UK. Keene and Webb lived a 20-minute drive away from each other. This might explain why the Somerton Man was wearing clothes believed to be American, with the name Keene on them. Finally, his dental records were not able to be matched to any known person. An autopsy was conducted, and the pathologist estimated the time of death at around 2 a.m. on December 1. On January 4, 2022, former Adelaide lawyer Sophie Halsman nominated Austrian milliner Charles Joseph Halban as the Somerton Man sources. The heart was of normal size, and normal in every way. Small vessels not commonly observed in the brain were easily discernible with congestion. There was congestion of the pharynx, and the gullet was covered with whitening of superficial layers of the mucosa with a patch of ulceration in the middle of it. The stomach was deeply congested. There was congestion in the second half of the duodenum. There was blood mixed with the food in the stomach. Both kidneys were congested, and the liver contained a great excess of blood in its vessels. The spleen was strikingly large, about 3 times normal size. There was destruction of the center of the liver lobules revealed under the microscope. Acute gastritis, hemorrhage, extensive congestion of the liver and spleen, and the congestion to the brain. The autopsy also showed that the man's last meal was a pasty eaten about 3 to 4 hours before death, but tests failed to reveal any foreign substance in the body. The pathologist, John Dwyer, concluded, "I am quite convinced the death could not have been natural. The poison I suggested was a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic. Although poisoning remained a prime suspicion, the pasty was not believed to be the source." Other than that, the coroner was unable to reach a conclusion as to the man's identity, cause of death, or whether the man seen alive at Somerton Beach on the evening of November 30 was the same man, as nobody had seen his face at that time. The body was then embalmed on December 10, 1948. After the police were unable to get a positive identification, the police said this was the first time they knew that such action was needed. On January 14, 1949, staff at the Adelaide railway station discovered a brown suitcase with its label removed, which had been checked into the station cloakroom after 11 a.m. on November 30, 1948. It was believed that the suitcase was owned by the man found on the beach. In the case were a red check dressing gown, a size 7 red felt pair of slippers, 4 pairs of underpants, pajamas, shaving items, a light brown pair of trousers with sand in the cuffs, an electrician's screwdriver, a table knife cut down into a short sharp instrument, a pair of scissors with sharpened points, a small square of zinc thought to have been used as a protective sheath for the knife and scissors, and a stenciling brush, as used by third officers on merchant ships for stenciling cargo. Also in the suitcase was a thread card of Barber brand orange wax thread of an unusual type. Not available in Australia, it was the same as that used to repair the lining in a pocket of the trousers the dead man was wearing. All identification marks on the clothes had been removed, but police found the name T. Keene on a tie, Keene on a laundry bag, and Keene on a singlet, along with 3 dry cleaning marks, 1171/7, 4393/7 and 3053/7. Police believe that whoever removed the clothing tags either overlooked these 3 items or purposely left the Keene tags on the clothes, knowing Keene was not the dead man's name. With wartime rationing still enforced, clothing was difficult to acquire at that time, although it was a very common practice to use name tags. It was also common when buying second-hand clothing to remove the tags of the previous owners. What was unusual was that there were no spare socks found in the case, and no correspondence. Although the police found pencils and unused letter stationery, a search concluded that no T. Keene was missing in any English-speaking country. A nationwide circulation of the dry cleaning marks also proved fruitless. All that could be garnered from the suitcase was that the front gusset and feather stitching on a coat found in the case indicated it had been manufactured in the United States. The coat had not been imported, indicating the man had been to America or bought it from someone of similar size who had been. Police checked incoming train records and believed the man had arrived at the Adelaide railway station by overnight train from either Melbourne, Sydney, or Port Augusta. They speculated he had showered and shaved at the adjacent city baths, although there was no baths ticket on his body, before returning to the railway station to purchase a ticket for the 10:50 a.m. train to Henley Beach, which, for whatever reason, he did not board. He immediately checked his suitcase at the station cloakroom before leaving the station and catching a city bus to Glenelg, although named City Baths. The centre was not a public bathing facility, but rather a public swimming pool. The railway station bathing facilities were adjacent to the station cloakroom, which itself was adjacent to the station's southern exit onto North Terrace. The city baths on King William St. were accessed from the station's northern exit via a laneway. There is no record of the station's bathroom facilities being unavailable on the day he arrived. An inquest into the man's death, conducted by coroner Thomas Erskine Cleland, commenced a few days following the discovery of the body but was adjourned until June 17, 1949. Cleland, as the investigating pathologist, re-examined the body and made a number of discoveries. He noted that the man's shoes were remarkably clean and appeared to have been recently polished, rather than in the condition expected of a man who had apparently been wandering around Glenelg all day. He added that this evidence fitted in with the theory that the body may have been taken to Somerton Park Beach after the man's death, accounting for the lack of evidence of vomiting and convulsions, which are the 2 main physiological reactions to poison. Cleland speculated that, as none of the witnesses could positively identify the man they saw the previous night as the same person discovered the next morning, there remained the possibility the man had died elsewhere and had been dumped. He stressed that this was purely speculation, as all the witnesses believed it was definitely the same person, as the body was in the same place and lying in the same distinctive position. He also found no evidence indicating the identity of the deceased. Cedric Stanton Hicks, professor of physiology and pharmacology at the University of Adelaide, testified that of a group of drugs, variants of a drug in that group he called number 1, and in particular number 2, were extremely toxic in a relatively small oral dose that would be extremely difficult if not impossible to identify even if it had been suspected in the first instance. He gave Cleland a piece of paper with the names of the 2 drugs, which was entered as Exhibit C18. The names were not released to the public until the 1980s, as at the time they were quite easily procurable by the ordinary individual, from a chemist, without the need to give a reason for the purchase. The drugs were later publicly identified as digitalis and wabain, both cardenolide-type cardiac glycosides. Hicks noted the only fact not found in relation to the body was evidence of vomiting. He then stated its absence was not unknown, but that he could not make a frank conclusion without it. Hicks stated that if death had occurred 7 hours after the man was last seen to move, it would imply a massive dose that could still have been undetectable. It was noted that the movement seen by witnesses at 7 p.m. could have been the last convulsion preceding death. Early in the inquiry, Cleland stated, "I would be prepared to find that he died from poison, that the poison was probably a glucoside and that it was not accidentally administered, but I cannot say whether it was administered by the deceased himself or by some other person." Despite these findings, he could not determine the cause of death of the unidentified man. Cleland remarked that if the body had been carried to its final resting place, then all the difficulties would disappear. After the inquest, A plaster cast was made of the man's head and shoulders. The lack of success in determining the identity and cause of death of the man had led authorities to call it an unparalleled mystery, and believe that the cause of death might never be known. Around the same time as the inquest, a tiny piece of rolled-up paper with the words Tamshud printed on it was found in a fob pocket sewn within the dead man's trouser pocket. Public library officials called in to translate the text identified it as a phrase meaning ended, or finished found on the last page of Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The paper's verso side was blank. Police conducted an Australia-wide search to find a copy of the book that had a similarly blank verso. A photograph of the scrap of paper was released to the press. Following a public appeal by police, the copy of Rubaiyat from which the page had been torn was located. A man showed police a 1941 edition of Edward Fitzgerald's 1859 translation of Rubaiyat, published by Whitcomb and Toombs in Christchurch, New Zealand. Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean, who led the initial investigation, often protected the privacy of witnesses in public statements by using pseudonyms. Lean referred to the man who found the book by the pseudonym Ronald Francis, and he has never been officially identified. Francis had not considered that the book might be connected to the case until he had seen an article in the previous day's newspaper. There is some uncertainty about the circumstances under which the book was found. One newspaper article refers to the book being found about a week or two before the body was found. Former South Australian Police Detective Jerry Feltis, who dealt with the matter as a cold case, reports that the book was found just after that man was found on the beach at Somerton. The timing is significant as the man is presumed, based on the suitcase, to have arrived in Adelaide the day before he was found on the beach. If the book was found 1 or 2 weeks before, it suggests that the man had visited previously or had been in Adelaide for a longer period. Most accounts state that the book was found in an open-roof car parked in Jetty Road, Glenelg, either in the rear floor well, or on the back seat. The theme of Rubaiyat is that one should live life to the fullest and have no regrets when it ends. The poem's subject led police to theorize that the man had committed suicide by poison, although no other evidence corroborated the theory. The book was missing the words Tamshud on the last page, which had a blank reverse, and microscopic tests indicated that the piece of paper was from the page torn from the book. In the back of the book were faint indentations representing 5 lines of text, in capital letters. The second line has been struck out, a fact considered significant due to its similarities to the fourth line, and the possibility that it represents an error in encryption. W. Rgobab Melo IW Exmliabo AIQ. In the book, it is unclear whether the first line begins with an M or W, but it is widely believed to be the letter W, owing to the distinctive difference when compared to the stricken letter M. There appears to be a deleted or underlined line of text that reads Mliawi. Although the last character in this line of text looks like an L, it is fairly clear on closer inspection of the image that this is formed from an I, and the extension of the line used to delete or underline that line of text. Also, the other L has a curve to the bottom part of the character. There is also an X above the last O in the code, and it is not known if this is significant to the code or not. Initially, the letters were thought to be words in a foreign language before it was realized it was a code. Code experts were called in at the time to decipher the lines, but were unsuccessful, and amateurs also attempted to crack the code. In 1978, following a request from ABC Television's journalist Stuart Littlemore, Department of Defense cryptographers analyzed the handwritten text. The cryptographers reported that it would be impossible to provide a satisfactory answer. If the text were an encrypted message, its brevity meant that it had insufficient symbols from which a clear meaning could be extracted, and the text could be the meaningless product of a disturbed mind. In 2004, retired detective Jerry Feltis suggested in a Sunday Mail article that the final line Im Samskab could stand for the initials of It's Time to Move to South Australia. Mosley Street. Jessica Thompson lived in Mosley Street, which is the main road through Glenelg. In 2009 to 2011, Derek Abbott's team concluded that it was most likely that each letter was the first letter of a word. A 2014 analysis by computational linguist John Relling strongly supports the theory that the letters consist of the initials of some English text, but finds no match for these in a large survey of literature, and concludes that the letters were likely written as a form of shorthand, not as a code, and that the original text can likely never be determined. A telephone number was also found in the back of the book, belonging to a nurse named Jessica Ellen Jo Thompson, 192120007, born Jesse Harkness in the Sydney suburb of Marrickville, New South Wales, who lived in Moseley St. Glenelg, about 400 meters, 1,300 feet, north of the location where the body was found. When she was interviewed by police, Thompson said that she did not know the dead man or why he would have her phone number and choose to visit her suburb on the night of his death. However, she also reported that, at some time in late 1948, an unidentified man had attempted to visit her and asked a next-door neighbor about her. In his book on the case, Jerry Feltus stated that when he interviewed Thompson in 2002, he found that she was either being evasive or she just did not wish to talk about it. Feltus believed Thompson knew the Somerton man's identity. Thompson's daughter Kate, in a television interview in 2014 with Channel 9's 60 Minutes, also said that she believed her mother knew the dead man. In 1949, Jessica Thompson requested that police not keep a permanent record of her name or release her details to third parties, as it would be embarrassing and harmful to her reputation to be linked to such a case.